Welcome to the Alain Elkann interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
Shai Baitel, artistic director of the MAM Shanghai, the Modern Art Museum of Shanghai. He's an Israeli lawyer who worked for the United Nations, then slowly turned into the art world and became an advisor, a curator in the contemporary art, worked with many important institutions, worked a lot in Miami, and now, since 2 years, he is the artistic director of the Museum of Modern Art in Shanghai. Shai Baitel, this is a great experience for you to be the artistic director of the first contemporary art museum in Shanghai, in China. Since you were in New York, in Israel, in many European countries, it must be a great difference.
Certainly. And not only is it a great difference, but also in such historic times, we all are undergoing with various challenges and crises. Nevertheless, this is a great opportunity because it gives you perspective. It gives you additional spice to the work that is already very challenging, intellectually speaking. And it certainly is in a place that for me was very enchanting when I first went to China and had a chance to be acquainted with the culture and the art and the peoples. And it was absolutely remarkable experience and get to know their own way and their own style in many senses. And for many years, China had developed culturally and artistically, and of course, economically and socially and so on, almost like a parallel universe to the rest of the world. So it would be incredibly interesting for us to look into everything relating to the way that society had developed and the way that art and culture consequently resembled. You know, we always say art is a mirror to society. It's absolutely a great opportunity.
We have different visions of China. In one way, it has been for years now the country where all the luxury brands and many other brands, are looking as most important market until not very long ago. Now things seems to have a bit changed, and changed because China is under the control of one party, and the party has to stay alive and therefore try to deal with the issues that they have. So how is it for a museum for contemporary art, for a Westerner like you, to lead a museum that somehow is linked to this party who is overwhelming everywhere in China? How is it? Who you deal with? What kind of freedom you have?
I think that every country, regardless to its location, circumstances will have its own challenges and will have its own day-to-day topics to deal with. And it has a lot to do with people and geography and development historically and so on and so forth. China is a unique case, obviously, because it's a very large country and it is very diverse in many, many ways. It has a certain regime and it's been this way for many, many years. And it is gradually has opened to the West over the past few decades. And as such, it is looking all the time to dialogue. And when it comes to a cultural dialogue, I think the Chinese had made a very interesting choice by allowing me to lead such an institution because they come with different approach to storytelling of the art. And I think another important element of it is that heading such an institution allows me to play a role of a cultural bridge. A cultural bridge would always be what we call a soft power that mitigate between peoples, between cultures, between nations, and allows the art, which is undoubtedly an international language, to do what a lot of other vehicles or approaches or platforms, diplomacy, for example, will not necessarily succeed. Therefore, I think that by selecting a Westerner artistic director, the Chinese would like to see different voices. They would like to see different artists. They would like to see a narrative that is told from another viewpoint because it's enriching their culture, their people, and it's bringing a lot of goodness that otherwise could have been perhaps more limited. It's just a different viewpoint. And I totally look at it as an opportunity to be a cultural bridge. And as such, I'm looking to involve artists from everywhere, not just the West, but obviously local Chinese artists and Asian for sure, and show how art is an instrument that connects and unites.
just before the pandemic, you had this big Bob Dylan show that was also in Miami, which is quite special in the sense that Bob Dylan is a symbol of America in a way. And then you had the Zaha Hadid show, British Iraqi architect, therefore music, architecture. And then you had a show of Andy Warhol and Lewis Carroll, again, something very Westerner. Are you planning now to do some big Asian or Chinese exhibition in the museum?
We are just working nowadays on a new concept for an exhibition of rising stars of the contemporary Chinese artist. And this effort is led by Barbara Polak, who's a very well-recognized curator in contemporary Chinese art. The concept is looking into various facets of art making in China, including prints, including what we call the copying and multiplication. So a lot of things that relate to multiplying of art in a way that the Chinese have been doing for centuries. It's a form, actually, and we in the West are looking all the time at editions, and whereas today 3D prints have become more and more usual niche of exercising art and sculpting and so on. And we want to show how in China this has been a method that was used for many, many years before. And I think it's a way for us also to recognize the power of a new Chinese artist, the diversity, the originality, novelty. A lot of the way that they present their art with new languages is completely novel, and we certainly don't see a similarity in the West when it comes to that. So it's a very exciting project that we've been working on for some time.
Being viewing all kinds of arts and artists, you worked in the past with famous artists like Marina Abramovic, Richard Serra, Jeff Koons, Bill Viola, and so on and so forth. But now we're talking about today. Is there a big difference between African artists, Asian artists, European artists, American artists? How is the art world of today? And the second question is, we are going through a very odd period, which is this remote Zoom world. Coronavirus, one way or the other, will end and people will go back to a kind of normal life sooner or later. But it's impossible that this big event has not changed the world and the world of art, and probably give birth to completely new artists, a new way of showing something else. Can you answer to this?
The first thing that would interest me when I'm meeting an artist is the authenticity of the art making, the language. We always say that you can recognize an artist by language. Language is an interesting thing because it's based on grammar and vocabulary. And artists that are true artists and are loyal to their DNA will continuously develop. And from one generation to another, you'll see how their language has developed in vocabulary as well as in their grammar. I do see a lot of originality in China. And it's a very interesting observation that I've had because I think that there is connection between patrons of art and the art and artist development. Through history, we would see that areas of the world that were blessed with artists and great art were also very prosperous economically. And we can see it in, obviously, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire. During Renaissance, clearly, England was such an empire that resulted in great, great artists. France, for sure. The US had its prime during the 70s, 80s, 90s, and so on. And now it's the time of China that has become a superpower economically. And when there is wealth and there's money, and there's going to be patrons. Naturally, when collectors buy more art, they give more freedom for artists to create because artists otherwise won't be able to make their living. An artist, while extremely rich in millions and millions of units of creativity, of originality, of different thinking, are gifting the world with this wealth, whereas businessmen and collectors are contributing their share in order for all of that to continue. They will also contribute to art institutions, museums, university, art departments, and so on and so forth. I'm mentioning it because it's an interesting period we live in when we all are witnessing the phenomenon of NFT. NFT is a phenomenon that directly connected to both art and investment, intellectual property, and a vehicle where you can place money that for many people hope that will grow its investment, will appreciate. Now, this is interestingly also coming in such a time that you mentioned is a pandemic, and we're so much used to the digital era because we're using more and more Zooms and screen time and virtual versus physical. and nothing more that NFT represents, because it's a link to art that otherwise we would experience in person, we would experience with all possible senses. And now through this link, you can pretty much see the artwork on any screen, and it will pretend to the original IP of the artist that created. NFT is also a form of patronism of art, because this is investment in some artist, and it allows the artist to continuously hold on to the original IP through the linking or the minting, and also allows them to enjoy the appreciation of the value of the artwork without a broker.
Can you explain to our readers or listeners what NFT is so that people can be clear on this subject?
NFT is an acronym for non-fungible tokens, and it pretty much summarizes the phenomenon of minting artwork, connecting it to cryptocurrency. What it does is allows for an artwork to become a digital version, and thus it is pretty much giving the owner a digital certificate over his original artwork. So it pretty much allows the maker of the artwork to hold on to the IP and declare through this certificate is the owner, and thereafter he can trade in it. This is in a nutshell NFT. Now, this can go from one end to another. It's almost like investing in commodities in such a way, because the market fluctuates, can go up, can go down. And it's a new form of trading in art. It's definitely a factor that's pushing the art world into a new direction. I can't say it's good or bad. I can only say that the volume of trade in NFT is grand. It's in billions of dollars. Now, some of the people in the NFT world are art lovers. Some of them are simply investors. Well, like in the traditional art collecting or dealership. And so what interests me specifically is how the NFT phenomenon contributes to the art making. In other words, going back to the question of patrons of art and the importance of patrons of art and collectors, I'd like to go back all the way in history to the church or times of the Medicis, which I just recently visited in Florence a few days ago. It was so important back then to allow artists exercise their art form and talent that the church had to fund all those remarkable frescoes and all those remarkable capellas and all those remarkable art you would see during Renaissance, because if not, it wouldn't happen. It is the Medicis as the most important family through history that were patrons of not only artists, also philosophers and scientists, because they understood that these people are exceptionally important for society, but otherwise would not be able to do what they do so greatly. Now, fast forward to the time we live today, we see investment through the form of NFT. It allows artists to create. Clearly, there's always going to be cynicism and investment, which has nothing to do with people thinking, oh my God, it's so important that we support artists because they're so important components for our society and culture. Of course, there will be those. And clearly, this was not anything that came from the art world. It came from the investment world. This was not a natural development. It's not a new niche of art. To be clear, we had painting, drawing, sculpting, video art, performance art, all kinds of art forms in contemporary art. NFT is not an art form. To be very clear, people speak about NFT art. NFT is an investment way in art, turning art into certificate, which allows investment. When it comes to that, it allows the art world to develop, but it is not coming from the art world. Andy Warhol, the NFT of Andy Warhol is gone. He's not obviously creating artwork to become digital version of it, to become the IP so it can have such certificates. NFT allows and enables to create those digital files in order to be minted and traded eventually and so on and so forth. I would say that many of the artists resent the idea. They do not want to become NFT. However, it's a trend, and it's a trend in investment. I think it's $20 billion. If the art world trade expanded from 60 billion to 70 billion, it means that it took away 10 billion investment from traditional art purchases.
What are the Chinese thinking about this?
It's very interesting. In China, NFT is curious because it is based on a certain cryptocurrency, Ethereum. And in China, the only cryptocurrency that's allowed to be traded is the government cryptocurrency. Therefore, NFT trade is not possible in China. But at the same time, there's appreciation in China for the art that is behind the NFT. So I think there's appreciation for the art, but the Chinese, like in every other matter, they do it their own way.
Imagine you are an artist and you work on an NFT. Your original work, where is it? And what do you do with it?
The original or the physical, as you refer to it, can be anything, but it has to turn into a digital file in order for it to be minted. This IP that I'm describing right now can be an image, it can be a video, it can be based on an original physical artwork. And look at the case for Warhol, clearly so. And then thereafter, it will have its own life on the NFT sphere.
Let's say you are like a collector who has a painting and puts it in a storage. But what about museums, art galleries, public spaces like your museum in Shanghai vis-a-vis this kind of art?
I will say that there's obviously collectors, like in every other niche. So there's those standout collectors. There's obviously the hidden arms that are pushing this trend. And then there's going to be institutions that decide this is already such a phenomenon that we cannot ignore, and we have to present it for the public to discuss it and to make their own call. I don't think institutions should take a stand because we don't really know where it's going. There's a difference between digital art and NFT art. When you go to an exhibition or an institution is presenting an NFT show, you have to be very clear that you're going to see a digital file that is presented on a screen usually or through projection. And what's important in NFT is that you can also see the metadata of the actual artwork. And I think museums and art institutions cannot ignore it. It exists, it's out there, and it's growing. So we need to be part of this dialogue. The fact is that we are little by little, generally speaking, going from physical into digital. I suggested in a presentation that I made that we can turn ourselves into NFT files now because we can offer the museum visitor to become his own digital file, i.e. an avatar. And thereafter, they receive it on a little key, disc on key, and they can mint it. So they can become their own NFT file. In other words, everything can be NFT'd. If Dorsey's first tweet can be NFT'd and the first edition of New York Times can be NFT'd and so on and so forth, every person can too, and he can trade his own NFT file. Is it a depressing or encouraging? I don't know. I think that when we started using those devices, we gave up on a lot of our physical being. Every time you press agree on any application, on any form, you're pretty much giving up on part of your physicality, of your actual existence. And if we go with the same, mode of thinking, clearly the world is becoming more and more digital, virtual. The pandemic has contributed greatly to this phenomenon, sadly. And it's a trend that we cannot reverse or stop. Art will always be the mirror of society. And we live in a digital era. The fact is that we don't go to see doctors, it's telemed. People don't go to universities or school, it's on Zoom. Everything that we do, we use smartphone as brokers. We don't purchase tickets to a tourist agent. We don't call our taxi company because there is Uber. We never pay anymore physically, there is only the device, and so on and so forth. In other words, if society has become so dependent and so used to the digital form of living our lives, then art as a mirror or as reflective of society is certainly going the same direction, the same trend. And if we stick to this principle, it is certainly in compliance with the method.
The question is, what will be the museum of tomorrow?
Museums were made, and they are and forever will be an educational institution. They're made to educate, to teach, to enrich the public through art. And art can tell a remarkable story, the story of an individual or a story of a group, story of society, of a nation, of a certain historic time. It can tell you a story of an event. It can tell you a story of a leader. Now, how do we tell the story today? How do we tell the story tomorrow? If we live in an ever-changing technological era, if these devices have led such a revolution because we consume content differently today, our attention span has changed. And this is something every museum artistic director or chief curator should, concern himself with every day, because our museum audience has changed. They're not anymore the usual one. We don't go to a museum and see Van Gogh today and moved or come to tears. These devices are flat. They're Instagram-led, they're image-led. And so in order for us to excite the audience and forget about exciting, engage, make them stop for a minute, leave the devices in the bags or in the pockets, look at an artwork, take it in, think about it, reflect about it, speak with the friends and family, come again, send others to see it. It's becoming a bigger and bigger challenge and a task. Museums should continuously concern themselves, how do we keep our audience not just coming, but growing and engaging? And I think it has to go hand in hand with the changes and with the trends. We know that art doesn't necessarily change in its way of becoming because it's based on originality, on creativity, on a unique storytelling. We also know that museum audience is coming, but is changing. Generation Z, Alpha, and those that will come after will not be millennials, will not be Generation X. It's different. We know the revolution of technology has changed the way the brain is consuming content. It changed our sensory ability. It is still and must be based on a multisensory experience. Therefore, I'm continuously emphasizing the importance of the experience of adrenaline. And we can do it today because we have more tools. We have diverse tools we didn't have in the past to give a different experience for a museum audience, for the museum visitor, and thus engage him in the way he understands today.
Let me tell you this. Once upon a time, until recently, museums were places for elites. Then, after the war, let's say, museums in themselves became more and more like statements. There were these archistars, including Zaha Hadid, Frank Gehry, and many others, who made cathedrals, right? These huge monuments that are contemporary museums. And there have been more and more people queuing to visit museums.
First of all, you're right in the sense that museums buildings have become their own art form. And with shrines like Zaha Hadid's Maxi in Rome, Renzo Piano's phenomenal museums anywhere, Frank Gehry's, of course, there's going to be others. Certainly, it's an attraction just to come and see the building from outside, inside, and the way it was done. I do not think that museums should be elitistic organizations or belong to just a group of elita, intellectual, bohemian part of our society. Absolutely not. Art is made and belongs to everybody, belongs to society, belongs to culture. And as such, it should invite, it should include, it should not exclude, it should be less elitistic, less patronizing, less intimidating. Look, the queuing that you mentioned for exhibitions, if you look at those that have been the most successful, have also been those concepts of museums that were led by phenomenal directors that understood that the definition of art or the definition of content that should be curated or conceived for exhibitions and museums should expand beyond the simple definition of contemporary art and go all the way to design, to fashion. The most popular exhibitions ever will be the Vienna Alexander McQueen, Dior, street art. That's very inviting, very including. These are the best sellers. Cause at Brooklyn Museum, you can get a ticket. And there's going to be many more examples. In other words, museum directors, some of them have changed their thinking and immediately got to the changes and understood the audience want to see something else. The audience want to see something different. And again, you spoke about the phenomenon of brands in China at the beginning of our conversation. If you look at those brands, the luxurious brand, they were also looking to expand and not stay just with the rich and the famous. Look at Virgil Abloh turning Louis Vuitton into a brand that everybody has an item today. Alessandro Michele's for Gucci has turned Gucci into a brand that everybody consumed. And even though it's expensive, everybody has one. Why? Because they took the DNA and they changed the language. They made it more affordable, not necessarily money-wise, but to take it in, to understand it. It is no longer so patronizing. It is no longer so elitistic in such a way. And they made great revenues to the shareholders. They made great revenues to the owners. So everybody's happy. Now, if you go back to the museums in this comparison, broadening the audience, inviting more, letting people enjoy the art, letting people enjoy what in culture has become such a phenomenon, even if it's from design.
In Shanghai, you are in China. There are many foreigners coming, but mostly Chinese. What kind of people are these Chinese people who come to the museum?
The museum is a museum for everybody. Shanghai is a very international city, certainly prior to the pandemic, and hopefully after the pandemic, it will become even more so. We have a diverse audience in the museum, many locals, many Chinese, young audience, curious for new art, culturally very updated, very fashionable, very trendy, smart, sophisticated audience. We saw people coming time and again. The Zaha Hadid exhibition has proven to be extremely interesting for the locals and was a great success artistically and otherwise. And I think that one of the most important things to understand is that there's growing sophisticated audience of museum visitors in China, and they're as eager to see new art forms and design and everything that's relevant as I find in the West.
How many people live in Shanghai?
Over 18 million, I think.
How many visitors you have in your museum?
Well, this question has to go before the pandemic, during the pandemic, you know what's going to be after. But we were able to relatively keep stable visitors. I think that Dylan seen quite a few hundreds of thousands between all the museums he traveled in China. Zaha did also saw a few dozens of thousands visitors, which was a great success. I wish we could have kept it open longer. All in all, because the situation of COVID in China is fairly controlled, we were able to keep the activity ongoing.
If you have to make a statement about your job, I have the feeling that your job over the years has changed quite a lot.
Principles of my work, of my job duty will not change. It's always what I call the holy three, the triangle between audience, space, and narrative. These are the three elements that I'm looking at, before conceiving every project. For me, the most important element is the audience because it's made for the audience. Art is made for people to experience, not just to look and feel and smell and sense and taste and so on. It is in a context of a space because we work in an indoor or an outdoor. It's always the case. And the narrative is the one thing that's very interesting because the narrative or the way you present the narrative can change. And this will go hand in hand with our ever-changing times. The rest of the fundamentals, will remain the same.
In this completely abstract and technological world, preparing yourself to the future, you spent your holidays visiting churches, museums in Italy.
I always say the way we know art begins in Italy. And I don't want to continuously suggest that the Italians are remarkable in the way that it is in the DNA. The best things will always come from Italy. And I visit Italy very often, not only because of the inspiration, but because of the roots and because of the fundamentals. And I told you I was in Florence because I wanted to go back to the Medici and to see all this incredible richness on walls and ceilings and so on. And continuously thinking to myself, wow, we can do this experience through videos. It's terrible what I'm saying. It will never be the same. However, it can travel today for people that cannot travel because of restrictions and can still take images and the colors and the vivid energy behind it. We can probably get it there. And funnily, that when you walk the residency there, and I was thinking, I couldn't escape the thought, how come we can replicate it into an experience that is video-based? It will never be the same. Never, don't get me wrong. But it can still be done and you can still disseminate the images and the story that was done back in the days in such a genius way. I also will say, Alan, that is another thing that I would never, ever in my life, I saw a Jeff Koons exhibition. Everybody is familiar with Jeff Koons' remarkable, conceptual art and the gazing balls, the balloons and so on. But in Italian context, when you see it in a palazzo, it's different. It's 10 times more powerful. It will never be the same like you see it at the Whitney. Forget it. It is so much more powerful when you see it in an Italian context. Why? Because there is no future without past. No future, absolutely no future without past. So we always have to go back to where it started.
Thank you very much for this conversation. We wish you a lot of success in Shanghai and in other places, and looking forward to see you soon.
Wonderful, Alan. Great to see you, and thank you so much.
Alain Elkann interviews.